Hello.
Hello, Alexis.
Hi, Ed. How are you?
I am great. It's great to see you. Welcome, everyone in the audience to this virtual program, a collaboration between the Science History Institute and the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. I'm Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach.
Indeed, I am Alexis Pedrick from the Science History Institute.
I am so happy we were able to, you and I have been talking for some time about doing things together, and we found a topic that reflects both of our collections tonight. So
yes,
this will be
just
very exciting.
exciting.
The format for the evening, everyone watching, what to expect is we'll be welcoming our guest, John Tresch, in a moment. He will give a presentation based on his new book, which I absolutely love. And then Alexis and I will share a couple things from our collections, from our respective institutions, that will relate to tonight's topic. And then we'll open up the floor to questions to our guest, and we will do that, right? So
Absolutely.
How can people ask questions, Alexis?
Well, people can ask questions right there in the YouTube chat. You can also, if you don't like, using the chat, you can also email us at education@sciencehistory.org. And I'm just going to run that in a banner on the bottom here so you all can take a look. And don't worry, we will remind you of this later in the evening so you all know how. But yeah, it's easy to join in on the conversation.
Great. Shall we bring John in?
I think we shall. We'll introduce John Tresch. He is a professor of history, of art, science, and folk practice at Warburg Institute at the University of London. So coming to us from a far away. He taught the history of science and technology in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania for over a decade. So local. And Tresch has held fellowships at the New York Public Library, Columbia University, the University of Chicago, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and I'm going to pronounce this terribly, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He is the author of The Romantic Machine, Utopian Science and the Technology After Napoleon, and also the book we are discussing tonight. So John, hello, welcome.
Hello, thanks. It's great to be here.
Welcome back to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
John.
Even if only virtually.
There you go.
Well,
thanks so much.
You're in our hearts.
It's the world we're in now, which is really great that we can do these programs with you over there.
Yeah.
Indeed. So it's very late for you, isn't it?
It's actually midnight. It's actually tomorrow. Yeah.
That's true. So you're coming to us from the future. I hope it's good.
Yes, it's both science fiction and Gothic.
Yeah, I like it.
Well, that works for Poe, absolutely.
Yes, that's the vibe we're going for this evening. So in a second, Ed and I are going to hop off screen, and we are going to leave you to do your thing and tell us a couple of really interesting things out of the book. Not everything, so you should all buy it and read it because it's fantastic. And so, yeah, are you ready to go?
I am.
All right, great. So I'm going to take us out of here, and the show is yours for a little bit.
So, great. So thank you, Alexis, and thank you for hosting this and making it happen. It's really great to be here back in Philadelphia through the wonders of Zoom and technology. As Alexis said, I lived in Philly for over 15 years. And the Rosenbach and the Science History Institute are two important places on my cultural map of the city. And of course, Philadelphia is also the place where Poe lived for the longest of any city as an adult, and where he wrote his most famous tales. So I want to give you a little taste of my book tonight in this brief talk to warm up. And I'm going to focus on Poe's life and writing in Philadelphia, which in the 1840s, while he was there, was really the beating heart of American science. You probably know Poe already from his scary stories like The Pit and the Pendulum, The Cask of Amontillado, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Black Cat, and you've heard The Raven. Maybe you memorized it in junior high, or you were refreshed with Bart Simpson in The Treehouse of Horror. Poe's tales of madness, obsession, and murder are deeply woven into American popular culture. They're the source of bad dreams and of endless memes. And here's some of the new ones. My book tells the full story of Poe's tragic life, but from a new angle. It focuses on his lifelong engagements with science. His brief life coincided with huge changes in the nature and place of science, and this is a period that historian of science Thomas Kuhn called the Second Scientific Revolution. There was a new push to mathematize nature. There was also a rise in specialization between different disciplines. A flood of new publications and popular presentations introduced chemistry, electromagnetism, biology, and astronomy. In lyceums and lecture halls, people went to hear these new sciences. Leading scientists, many of them based in Philadelphia, also strove to create new institutions to forge a national framework for American science. The idea there was to allow scientists to speak with a single authoritative voice, to shut down frauds, charlatans, and forgers, and to compete on equal terms with research being done in Europe. Poe's writings are mind-bogglingly diverse. He published in a huge range of magazines and newspapers, but one recurrent theme is his fascination with science. He lectured on the rational principles of literature in the very same halls where natural historians, geologists, phrenologists, and mesmerists explain their work. He wrote in loud support of new national initiatives like the South Seas Exploring Expedition, and supported plans to use the crates of gold left to the US government by Robert Smithson for a national research university, which in 1846 became the Smithsonian Institution. Even his speculative and horror fiction was shaped by new developments in the science. At times, he straightforwardly dramatized science's perspectives, like in the story A Descent into the Maelstrom, which he wrote in Philadelphia. It tells of a Norwegian sailor whose ship is caught in a whirlpool. The sailor uses Baconian observation and inductive reasoning to find a way to ride out the storm. But at other times, Poe cast a more critical eye on science's blind spots. He worried about the new obsession for rule-based methods, what we'd now call algorithms. He also feared that objective detachment might bring a technical exploitation of nature and humans that might destroy both. One of his earliest works was an attack on a 19th century version of artificial intelligence. This was a Turing chess-playing machine, the automaton chess player of Maelstrom. In a blistering argument, Poe claimed that this mechanical human could not play chess, as its presenter claimed, by clockwork alone. There had to be a human hiding inside it, moving the pieces. No machine, he argued, could replace the complexities of human thought. But Poe also published convincing scientific hoaxes of his own, one about a balloon that crossed the Atlantic, others about the strange new science of mesmerism, which was a form of hypnosis which explored the limits of consciousness. These hoaxes were imaginative feats, but they also suggested how gullible people had become toward the relentless claims of new discoveries and scientific progress. And in a bizarre but fascinating work that he wrote at the end of his life, Eureka, A History of the Material and Spiritual Universe, he challenged contemporary scientists for their restricted, lifeless view of the cosmos. Now, Poe's engagements with science were immensely strengthened during his time in Philadelphia from 1838 to 1844. He had been born in 1809 in Boston, the son of actors who died by the time he was 2. He was raised in Richmond by a foster father, John Allen, who disowned him at the age of 18. He then joined the Army and served as an artificer, which meant he repaired his battalion's equipment. He began officers training at West Point Military Academy, which exposed him to the cutting edge of mathematics, astronomy, physics, and engineering. Setting out then as an author in Baltimore, his poems and stories earned him a position as an editor in Richmond, but in 1837, he was fired from that job for drinking too many mint juleps. He then spent a few months in New York, just as a nationwide financial depression hit. So what brought Poe to Philadelphia at the age of 29? Well, it was a job offer, and he was invited to write a scientific textbook. The natural historian, Thomas Wyatt, needed a shorter, cheaper version of his textbook on conchology, which is the classification of shells, that he would then sell at his popular lectures. Poe talked with Wyatt, with the geologist Isaac Lee, and consulted French textbooks at the Library Company on Locust Street, in a reading room that was overlooked by a giant bust of Athena, which might have given him some ideas for the setting of The Raven. The result was the conchologist's first book, a portable, inexpensive seashell collecting guide, which would be the best-selling book that Poe wrote during his lifetime, and it went through 3 editions. Philadelphia was called the Athens of America. It had the country's most active culture of research, experiment, and invention. Besides the American Philosophical Society, Philadelphia was home to the Academy of Natural Sciences and the Franklin Institute. The physicist Joseph Henry, the future director of the Smithsonian, was part of a club of researchers at the Franklin who studied magnetism, steam engines, and storms. In public scientific performances, there was a strong emphasis not just on instruction, but on entertainment. Eerie performances of animal magnetism and dazzling displays of magic lanterns enthralled their audiences. Many lectures also courted controversy. The anatomist Samuel Morton was famous and now notorious for his collection of skulls, many stolen from graves or taken from enslaved Africans or captive Native Americans. Morton used measurements of these skulls to argue against the biblical account of creation for a hierarchy among human races. He helped bring George Combe, the Scottish phrenologist, to Philadelphia to inform crowds about how to read the personality of themselves and others off the bumps on people's heads. At the center of Philadelphia's scientific activity was Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, the West Point graduate Alexander Dallas Bache. From UPenn and the Franklin Institute, he went on to lead the U.S. Coast Survey, turning it into a national program for scientific training and for mapping the newly seized territories in the West. In his hometown, Bache encouraged research in steam, electricity, and optics. He also wrote the first American appreciation of the earliest form of working photography, the daguerreotype, publishing it in 1839, just after it was announced in Paris. The daguerreotype caught Poe's eye, too. It's been argued that this image shows Poe, there on the right in sideburns, in the Academy of Natural Science in 1840. The man on the left is Morton. Whether or not it actually is Poe, he did have sideburns at the time, he was definitely immersed in Philadelphia's distinctive culture of scientists, inventors, and artists. And he followed Bache's announcement of the daguerreotype with an article of his own on the invention. He wrote, "In truth, the daguerreotyped plate is infinitely, and we use the term advisedly, is infinitely more accurate in its representation than any painting by human hands. If we examine a work of ordinary art by means of a powerful microscope, all traces of resemblance to nature will disappear. But the closest scrutiny of the photogenic drawing discloses only a more absolute truth, a more perfect identity of aspect with the thing represented." For Poe, the daguerreotype became a magical portal, unveiling an endless succession of views into hidden layers of reality, each more subtle than the last. And this was a typical move for him. Poe drew out hidden possibilities within the sciences, approaching them from new angles, pushing them to their limits, revealing their fantastic dimensions. In Philadelphia, he cultivated this persona of the expert reasoner. In a series on cryptography or secret writing, he challenged readers to submit encoded texts, which he would then decipher. His chapters on science and art explained new inventions and theories, making him one of America's first science reporters. And with his tales, which he began in Philadelphia, featuring C. Auguste Dupin, the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, he invented the detective story. And he fixed in public imagination the image of the eccentric, ingenious reasoner who outsmarts both criminals and cops. By the start of 1842, Poe was riding high. He was the lead critic for Graham's magazine, which had a subscription list of over 30,000. His stories had been collected as the tales of the grotesque and arabesque. He hobnobbed with Charles Dickens during Dickens' U.S. tour. With his aunt and his young wife, Virginia, who's pictured on the right, he was living in relative comfort on 17th and Spruce, and could even afford some indulgences, like this French pocket watch, which you can see engraved with his name. It was recently auctioned for $300,000, and I think Poe could have used that money at the time. But in February of that year, things took a tragic turn. While she was singing, Virginia burst a blood vessel and began coughing up blood. This was a sure sign of consumption for which there was no cure. Poe suddenly quit his job at Graham's and began a spell of terrifying drinking binges. In this grim period, he also crafted stories that would make his legend. Sharp, shocking tales of guilt and horror, including The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, and his masterpiece of morbid suspense, The Telltale Heart, which he wrote in Philadelphia. And I always picture him writing it and imagining a narrow and gloomy Trinity row house as the setting for this story. Though The Telltale Heart used language and imagery from the sciences, Poe gave his readers an experience not of certainty and reassurance, but of disorientation and horror. It opens in the middle of a conversation, perhaps during an asylum visit or at a jail. A narrator boasts of the sharpness of his senses. It famously begins, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story." The speaker has become fixated on the opaque eye of the old man who shares his house. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell on me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. He proceeds with cool, objective detachment towards an irrational goal. With patience and precision, he stalks the man, peering into his room at midnight with a lantern open just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. On the seventh night, the old man awakens, sensing the intruder. After an agonizing silence, he stealthily opens his lantern until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. At once he hears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. The beating of the terrified old man's heart, so loudly he fears that neighbors will hear him. In its detail and regularity, the description mimics the report of a meticulously designed scientific experiment. Light, usually a symbol of knowledge and reason, is here associated with madness. The darkened room recalls the camera obscura, the technical core of the daguerreotype, an enclosed space into which images of the outside world were projected. But yet the light that pierces this room is artificial, and what's projected is the thread of a spider ensnaring its prey. The tale also restages one of the primal scenes of modern science, Isaac Newton's Prism experiments in the optics. There, Newton detailed the steps through which he cracked open a shutter to let a single ray of light into a darkened room and dismembered it with a prism, revealing the colors of the spectrum. Poe's tale inverts Newton's experiment, making vision and methodical reason the agents of perversity and death. He flips the heightened sensitivity of the new precision instruments of the sciences into a pathology, allowing his narrator to perceive many things in hell. The narrator then murders the old man. Methodical as ever, he dismembers the body and buries its parts beneath the floorboards. The police arrive. He coolly entertains them, offering refreshments, placing their chairs on the guilty floorboards. He then begins to hear, once again, a constant beating, like a watch wrapped in cotton, his dead victim's heart growing louder and louder. The merciless pounding and the chatter of the police drive him to a frenzy, until at last he cries out in agony and confesses his crime. Just as his desire to demonstrate his reasonable calm led him to the uncovering of the murder, his heightened senses gave him access to sounds that took him beyond the limits of normal experience. By detailing an act of violent irrationality in the language of scientific method, Poe was dramatizing the dark side of the Enlightenment, a vision uncannily familiar to Americans enmeshed in an allegedly rational economic and political order defined by ruthless competition, slavery, and violent settlement. though it was usually presented to them in soothing tones of equality, freedom, and progress, beneath the appearance of calm reason pulsed veins of terror, obsession, and cruelty. Poe gave the screw another turn. While the heart beneath the floorboards might symbolize the narrator's criminal madness, the monstrous guilt that his reason and patter cannot mask, it also echoes the ultimate symbol of method and rationality, a mechanical watch, the embodiment of the clockwork universe, and the icon of natural theology and the argument from design. The tale peels back one rational surface to reveal inexplicable forces. But when another layer is lifted, these forces are revealed as instruments of a deeper mechanism with a reason all its own. The story also made for a damn good read. The tale has terrified school children and delighted adults ever since its publication. After Virginia's crisis, things went worse and worse for Poe in Philadelphia. He declared bankruptcy and headed to New York, where he scrambled to survive. Despite harsh conditions, he reached his first national success with The Raven. He went on to explore the distant reaches of the mind with mesmerists and the founders of spiritualism, and in 1848, he wrote Eureka, his scientific and poetic cosmology. It was later admired by Einstein. It might have been an influence on the authors of the modern Big Bang Theory, and it explained why the night sky is dark. But those are stories for another night. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Hello. That was fantastic.
That is great, and I love your telltale heart reading.
Yes.
A story, written in Philadelphia, and part of a story that I always call Philadelphia Gothic. Now we can also call that story Philadelphia Science. A Philadelphia Science
I like
story.
that. Yes. I was mesmerized. I'm glad when you said it's over. I was like, oh no, it's over? What? I'm in the moment.
Now there's the book to read to get all the other details, which is wonderful.
True.
John, and anybody, if you have a question, throw it in the comments, please.
Yes.
Any and all questions, and we will relay them to John. But I have one to start. We want to share some things from our collection first. I'm all ready to ask questions.
I know. I'm with you. I'm so in it. I was like, yes, questions. Let's go.
Well, before we do that, let's just ask one question of John.
Yeah.
I think this is the bio we needed of Poe, John. I mean, there's so many Poe bios out there, and this one though gives us this great perspective, a new window to look at Poe, because in which people don't associate him with science. It's just horror, and it's so I'm just wondering how you first got interested in looking at Poe from that scientific point of view.
Well, from Poe himself, because there's an amazing collection, a Penguin collection of Edgar Allan Poe's science fiction that I borrowed from a friend. And some of those stories I knew, some of them were familiar, but lots of them I'd never heard of. And these were exactly the ones about, for instance, Maelstrom's chess player, or the ones about the mesmeric tales, the stories of mesmerism and hypnosis. It also ends with Eureka, which was this very strange cosmology. And the footnotes in that book are fantastic, but they're also really hard to make sense of. They're really hard to contextualize. And there really wasn't a story that tied it all together. The author kind of assumed you knew how it all fit. And I looked, and there really wasn't a book that explained how it all fit, that explained how Poe was the author of things like The Raven, Annabel Lee, and also all kinds of really visionary stories that like The Domain of Arnheim, which is one of my favorites, but also these very detailed science fiction stories, these very detailed examinations of the science of the time. There wasn't a big picture that made that all make sense and set it in his time period and set it in the context of what sciences were being developed, how they were being communicated, and how that was changing, which is exactly what Poe was responding to. And to my amazement, I mean, I read that book like more than 20 years ago. I figured someone would write that book by then, but no one did. So I wrote the book to fill that gap.
Great.
That is.
Well, we have a couple questions rolling in, so why don't Alexis and I we'll present a couple things from our collection, and everyone, while you're watching, keep asking questions to throw them in there, and we'll hit them when we're done.
Please do.
Short presentation. Do you want to go yours first, or how do we do on this?
Sure. Sure. We can do that. And I am just going to run the instructions for questions down here. True to the wide world of technology. The original email I gave you is crashing for some reason. It won't open. So we're going to borrow our lunchtime lectures email here. So if you do not want to ask your question in the chat, you can also drop it in this email. And you've got some time to do that. And I have my eye on it right now. So if something comes through, I will add it to the mix. And John, we will ask you. So let's see. So I have a little something to share. All right. So I'm excited about this because we were talking the other day and I kind of had some other ideas about stuff that I might bring up. And then we somehow got on the topic of Humphrey Davy, which is exciting for us because our next fellow in focus is on November 9th. And Frank James, who I think you know, is going to be talking about Humphrey Davy in all his glory. I think it's called Humphrey Davy, Enlightenment chemist, poet, and social climber, which will give you the vibes of the talk. So it'll be a lot of fun. But we were going through this and, I was thinking, all right, what's our connection to Poe? Because you would not necessarily think that we have one. So our connection turns out to be Humphrey Davy. For those of you who don't know, as I learned, he was an English chemist and an inventor. He invented the field of electrochemistry. I will show you, let's see. He is really most well known for his work on the incandescent, what we consider to be the incandescent light bulb. So the thing that was, fancied up, let's say, by Thomas Edison. The first one that we get is invented by Sir Humphrey Davy in 1809, and then it's advanced by Edison. So let's see if I can get this to move. Let's see. Does not want to. Let's see. So then as we were sort of chatting about Humphrey Davy, you brought up a really interesting story about Poe and Humphrey Davy being directly connected here. And so I was excited to share that because one of the things we have in our collection is his outlines of a course of lectures on chemical philosophy. And I was gonna tag you and ask you if you might want to tell a little bit of that story.
Yeah, of course. There's an indirect connection, which is that Davy is at the Royal Institution in London and giving these incredibly popular, spectacular science lectures. And he's friends with Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the whole mix of romantic poets. And there's really something similar in the kind of searching after novel effects and kind of breathtaking, sublime views of nature in the way that Humphrey Davy writes and the way that he performs. That's very much aligned with what's going on with romantic poetry and literature at the time. And Poe kind of takes both of those things on board. And the kinds of popular spectacle that Poe is contributing to and writing about is really pioneered by Davy, and later Michael Faraday takes up the same position, the inventor and scientist, the expert on electricity. Right. So there's this indirect connection. I mean, they're kind of shaping the background of the world that Poe's in, but very directly, Poe cites Davy a couple times in his work. Once he plagiarizes a piece of Davy's that is basically a funeral oration about a Christian scientist, a scientist who's Christian, a natural theologian. Right. And Davy's talking about what a great Christian he was and his views of nature. And Poe takes that into a much less religious perspective. He uses the same words to talk about nature as this terrifying, destructive place, and really kind of really transforms the context. But another place where he cuts and pastes Humphrey Davy is in a very late story of his called Von Kempelen's Experiment. And this is another one of his hoaxes. And it's a story written as a scientific news report about a man who has figured out how to turn lead into gold. So someone who's achieved the goal of all the alchemists of the past. And he has a very clever way of kind of revealing bit after bit of what's happening. And that includes citing other sources. And he cites in this story, Poe cites the notebook of von Kempelen, and has these passages in it directly from it. And it turns out those are passages taken from Humphrey Davy's notebooks, but they're not from his ordinary chemistry notebooks. They're from his psychological reports of when he and his friends are taking nitrous oxide for the first time, when they're having these frolics.
Right.
Inhaling laughing gas and writing down what it does to them. So there's jokes at every level of this piece that Poe's writing, and all kinds of in-jokes that have to do with the history of alchemy and the history of chemistry and romanticism.
Yeah, for sure. I actually just pulled up. So we have a online magazine called Distillations. We wrote an article about this, and so you can see in that corner that that lovely illustration of what is a very, very serious scientific moment. Yeah, that he's sort of poking fun at. And I love this. When you told me the story, I was really I was excited, because I also think this is one of the great things that Poe does, is he's really fantastic at both. He's in this moment, but he's also satirizing a lot of the things he's looking at, and a lot of these people that he is around, people who we sort of like are like, we kind of hold in this awe, and Poe kind of reminds us, like, no, they're regular people.
Yeah. And he's often satirizing himself too. And I mean, Humphrey Davy's aspirations, right? His social climbing, Poe was aiming for the same thing. I mean, he was broke. He was starving for much of his life. He was doing everything he could to become famous and to actually just feed himself and his family. And he was using a lot of the same kinds of tricks of celebrity that were just coming into their own at this period. Using the press, putting out fake announcements about himself, like kind of, tweeting and retweeting himself, but also, planting biographies in different articles, planting reviews, more or less trading favors with people to review his works and he'd review theirs, but also using the new technologies of the press, but the daguerreotype as well. I mean, we know one of the reasons we have such a strong image of Poe is because he was out there getting his picture taken at the very moment when that becomes possible for the very first time. Yeah. And he mocks all those tricks that scientists, politicians, and writers use to create themselves as these larger than life figures at the same time that he's using all those techniques. So there's a lot of satire and a lot of self-satire in what he's doing.
For sure. No, I love that. And if you want to go to examine any of these images really up close, I will link our digital collection in the chat, and you can go down the rabbit hole. You can download them. You can check them all out. And Ed, you have some cool stuff to share with us.
You mentioned, John, Poe being fascinated with the daguerreotype and that technology. It's amazing that we have he was so fascinated. He had, I think there's 5 daguerreotypes of him from the last 3 years of his life. And that's why we all think of him with the mustache too, because it was only in those last couple of years that he had a mustache, and then he took all the photos. He had all the photos taken of himself. But he recognized that this was a technology that could, help publicize him, help create him in the public eye as a serious figure, and pursued it. And here is another. Poe is also fascinated with another scientific endeavor in the 19th century, and that is mesmerism.
Oh.
And he wrote a story called, and this isn't the title of his story. Poe writes a story called "Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar," which is about a mesmerist who is contracted to mesmerize a man who's dying, Valdemar, at the moment of death, and see what they can learn. And he does so. And then horrific, things ensue. like he's under for 7 months and they can't get anything out of him, but he is mesmerized. And then finally, he responds, for God's sake, end it. I'm dead. Please.
And then he collapses into a puddle of unutterable putrescence.
Yes. And actually, one of the few moments where you really get the gore, the grotesque kind of gore in Poe. Usually he avoids that kind of thing, believe it or not. And in that story, it's the ending of the story is like that. But this is a publication. And then Poe publishes this in a couple places, one magazine and also in the Broadway Journal when he's in New York. And it's picked up. It's published in different magazines, periodicals, dozens of times over the next few years. But this is a publication that's in our collection, and this is from London, and it was published there, not with his Valdemar title, but with this very, pseudo-scientific sounding title, Mesmerism in Articula Mortis, Mesmerism at the Moment of Death, as astounding and horrifying narrative showing the extraordinary power of mesmerism in addition with the Progress of Death. By Edgar Allan Poe, Esquire of New York, and it's very small. It is just 16 pages, 8 pages, folded over. It's hand stitched, very thin, very fragile. That this has even survived this long in such great condition is wonderful. You can see the little stitching there, and it opens up. And there's an advertisement, and this is the beginning of the story. And the advertisement plays the game. The advertisement, plays the, astonishing narrative first appeared. The effects of this mesmeric influence in this case was so astounding. And I love the last line here. It is only necessary to add that credence is given to it in America where the occurrence took place. So a little joke at the end there. But also clearly, people could just believe that this occurred.
Right.
Yeah.
They pick this up.
And that story, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote to Poe to say, your Valdemar is making the rounds of the newspaper. Do tell. Is it true? Is it true? And Poe never gave it away, never said. He said, they're debating it. Some people say it must be fake. Some say it's obviously true. I won't say a word. Yeah. And that just kept the controversy going.
He loved to do that. And even if Poe doesn't do that, or if there's no controversy around, Poe might be writing a letter under a pseudonym to a paper to make sure that he gets something going. He does that more
for
than
sure
in his life. So.
Yeah, there's the whole controversy he has with Longfellow, who's the most beloved poet at the time, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And Poe writes a couple critiques of Longfellow where he belittles some of his writing and also accuses him of plagiarism. Yeah. And then after one of his worst accusations, there's immediately published in another newspaper, this is while he's in New York, a defense of Longfellow saying how absurd Poe's claims are, who is Poe to attack this great bard, and then Poe responds to him, and there's another response, but there's pretty good reason to believe that the person who was attacking Poe was actually Poe himself, writing under
Outis, Outis. Yeah,
exactly.
Oh, that's great.
So suddenly Poe's in the public mind as this rival to the greatest poet in America, when no one had thought to consider the two together before that.
Right.
So it's pretty cunning as publicity.
I love the idea of how he engages with science and he writes about science, and science, the scientific method influences the way he writes and creates work, but he's also not above exploiting the kind of performative aspect of science which was going on, especially with mesmerism. Is that correct, in the 19th century?
Oh yeah, for sure. And mesmerism's quite distinctive in the sense that it's a new science, and it also seems to threaten the authority of other sciences because the other sciences are getting part of their authority through the idea that if you can see it, it's true, and relying on the visible senses. Whereas mesmerism works through other senses. It works through hearing, through touch, and also through this possibility of communication across space and time. It seems to be violating the laws of nature that are being laid down by these other sciences. And yet it uses the language of chemistry, of electricity, of physics to explain what might be going on. And always, as you showed in that great pamphlet, it always uses the language of simple scientific fact. So even though what's happening seems to be beyond what we understood nature to be, it's presented as strictly observed, strictly empirical. And so, yeah, mesmerism is very much using science as a way to push beyond the boundaries of science. But it's true in all the sciences that there are people who are lecturing, writing in a very dramatic way about what's out there, but also performing. I mean, this is back to Humphrey Davy, back to Faraday. Yeah. Right there, in order to convince people, they're putting their own bodies on the line. Davy has these fantastic, those lights he uses have a kind of have an industrial use. He comes up with a lamp that you can use in mines, but it's also, this is the birth of cinema. This is like large scale spectacle, blinding viewers with this never before seen artificial light. That's what people are paying to see as much as they are to learn about chemistry. And there's many, many cases of scientists who are promoting their work and their ideas, but while they're doing so in public stage, on the public stage, in a way that some of their friends, like Alexander Dallas Bache or Joseph Henry, are a little worried about, a little uncomfortable with, that maybe they've gone a bit too far. They've gone too far into charlatanism, too far into quackery. And it's really a moment when the line between what's respectable science, what's legitimate, fact-based science, and what's showmanship or what's pure speculation, extremely blurry. And there aren't any authorities to kind of say this is legitimate science and this is just quackery. Yeah. And that's part of what's so amazing about this period, and what Poe makes the most of. He really takes advantage of that uncertainty.
Awesome. Wow. This is like, so first of all, we have lots of questions coming through in the chat. I want to let you know. So we're in for a good conversation. I'm so excited to have so many people join us. I'm delighted. The Swarthmore Public Library, the Retro Readers, I guess, is here. We got a book club meetup going on, which is
they were just at the Rosenbach not long ago too.
Awesome. So this is like the new
Jennifer and
world.
People. Thank you for coming. It's really great.
Yeah. We're glad to have y'all. And you have many fans. People really, really enjoyed the book. So I guess let us kick off with our first question that actually does come from the Swarthmore Public Library. So their question is, did Poe view alcoholism from the standpoint of it being a disease? He seems to explore this in the story The Black Cat.
Oh, yeah, he definitely does in that story for sure, and he knew what he was writing about. I mean, he did suffer from alcoholism. He had a curious relationship to alcohol. There were few periods in his life where he was a regular drinker, but when he drank even just a small glass, he became insane, and then would go on these binges that would last for days or weeks. And of course, that was just incredibly destructive for his relationships, destructive for his life, for his professional life, and for his health. And ultimately, that's what killed him. There's lots of debates about what actually killed him, but he had drunk a great deal the day before he died. And in The Black Cat, he talks about the disease which has destroyed his body and destroyed his mind. The difference somewhat between that language that we use now of alcoholism as a disease and the way Poe was writing is that it was even more religiously inflected at the time. I mean, there still is, 12-step programs have the higher power that's going to rescue you from alcoholism. But at that point, it was deeply written into in religious terms. And so if someone was intemperate, right, there were great temperance movements to try to bring them out of that intemperance that were very closely connected to the churches, but it was also seen possibly as a mark of damnation. And that's part of what's going on in The Black Cat is this sense of things going all right, but then his inevitable predestined nature leading him astray, and alcohol being the fuel, being the fiend that pushes him further and further down that line. And that's part of a huge genre in the early 19th century of temperance writing, which after reading that story, I mean, it's terrifying of a man who just loses all his perspective, loses everything that's dear to him, and basically loses his life. But after reading that story, you're shocked. The expectation with that genre is then you realize the danger of alcohol and you swear you'll never drink again. You join a temperance society if that story speaks to you. And Poe himself joined a number of temperance societies in his lifetime. In 1849, really a couple weeks before he died, when he was in Richmond, he joined the Sons of Washington and swore never to drink again. But unfortunately, he didn't keep that vow.
Right. For sure. For sure. Let's see. I kind of want to take another question, and I'm also going to give Ed and I a chance to take advantage of being hosts and jump in and ask our own questions because we have the power. But this is a really good one. From Amy Patel wants to know, which scientist did Poe influence? And I kind of like love this question because in the history of science we always talk about sort of this idea of like science as a community, as people having all these conversations back and forth and influencing each other and all those sorts of things. It's one of the things actually I love about your book is you sort of like you present this like ecosystem of science instead of like it is lively and all of this is like happening and Poe is like in the midst of it. So this is an awesome question. So which scientist did Poe influence, if any?
Well, and in those conversations of the ideas going back and forth, they're not only quoting each other as scientists, they're also, saying, what movie did you see? What books have you read? And one of the big sources for people who became scientists, especially at the end of the 19th century, is Poe. I mean, people read him. They read his speculations. They read his actual works. I mean, I can name two who are almost certain to have been influenced by Poe, who are massive. Alexander Friedman, who's a Russian scientist, and Georges Lemaitre. And Lemaitre, it's a little bit conjectural, but there's almost no way that he could have avoided Poe because he's writing in the early 20th century. He's a Belgian scientist as well as a Jesuit priest who's in contact with Paul Valéry, who wrote an appreciation of Eureka. And showed how Eureka is in agreement with certain aspects of Einstein. Now, the reason I mention these two, Friedman said that Poe was his favorite author alongside Dostoevsky. So that one's case closed. The reason I mention these two is that they are the ones who announced and invented the Big Bang Theory, which is the cosmological, scientifically understood theory of the universe as we know it today. And in many ways, that story of the universe emerging from a single particle and exploding outward rapidly, that's the story of the universe that Poe sketches in Eureka. So it's not hard and fast proof. They never say, I came up with this idea because I read Eureka, but there's pretty strong circumstantial evidence. Another route through which Poe influenced a lot of people is through the people that he influenced, the authors he influenced. So Arthur Conan Doyle says in the first Sherlock Holmes story, oh yes, you'll think that I resemble Auguste Dupin. Like he acknowledges Poe's influence. Lots of people read Sherlock Holmes and said, I want to be a chemist. I want to be a detective. I want to go into the sciences. And Jules Verne, the great French science fiction writer, spent his whole life imitating Poe, imitating his adventure stories, imitating his science fiction stories. And there are multiple cases at the end of the 19th century, in the early 20th, of scientists who say they got motivated to become inventors or become physicists, to become explorers after reading Jules Verne. So in that case, it's slightly indirect. Nevertheless, it's a pretty powerful influence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's awesome. So there you have it. I hope that answered your question for sure. Let's see. Okay, so let's see. We have a couple more questions.
One more I would add, going back to the first one, is that in what did Poe view alcoholism from the standpoint of being a disease? That becomes a very strong 20th century way of seeing things through psychology, through psychiatry and psychology, and Sigmund Freud and his students all read Poe. And part of what popularized psychoanalysis in France was a book written by Freud's student Marie Bonaparte, which explains Poe in Freudian terms. Yeah. So a whole generation of psychoanalysts owe their vocation to Poe, although it was reading his pathologies in Freudian terms.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes sense, though. It kind of makes sense. I mean, it, like I said, it confirms this idea of sort of science as this living, breathing thing, this community. So, So I wanna. We have a few more questions, but I wanna steal a moment for Ed, you or I, if we have questions to ask. So, do you have one you want to ask?
I love the that the idea that, well, here it is, and especially this, I think, relates to Eureka, in that Poe has a definition of poetry, and his definition of poetry, if you say, what's poetry? And my kids know this answer too. Poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty. And that's Poe's definition of it. And I love that it's both rhythmical, which is measured and planned, and beauty. And for Poe, poetry's not didactic. It is something that, is inspirational and leads to, emotion but it strikes me also that his final work, Eureka, kind of adheres to that idea, like it's a treatise on the rhythmical creation of the universe, in a sense.
That's nice.
And I wanted to ask you a little more about Eureka, that you touched on very briefly in your presentation. It's the last big work of Poe's career, and it's science.
Yeah, it's a peculiar science, but it is science. I mean, he's citing Alexander von Humboldt, Newton, Kepler, scientists of the day. He's talking about the recent discovery of Neptune. He's arguing with the theory of the nebular hypothesis, which is the idea that the solar system came into being through a nebula condensing, a swirling nebula, and as it condensed, it left in its wake planets at each ring, and then the center, the sun, is what's left of that nebular gas. He's arguing with that and using it, applying it to the universe as a whole. So he's very engaged with science at the time. But as you say, he's also coming up with a new theory of where the universe came from. He's extrapolating beyond the factual explanations that people have to imagine, what must the universe have been like? Where must it have come from? What must God's ideas have been that the universe can resemble the form that it does, that it takes the form that it does? And exactly as you say, he does a kind of literary criticism of the universe. God must be using the same principles for organizing the universe as Poe uses for organizing a poem. And it's, as you say, the rhythmical creation of beauty. And it's always going to be the simplest route toward a chosen end. What is the unity of effect? How do you build in every element of the system so that it produces a single emotional or intellectual effect on the reader? And the unity of effect that Poe describes in the universe is basically the expansion and contraction of the universe over millennia, over and over again. He's essentially applying literary criticism to astronomy and to cosmology. And so it is a science text, but it's also a literary critical text, very much in line with all the writings he'd done before that. And he's basically thinking of God, the creator, who is not the Christian God. It's a God. It's a very pantheist notion of the universe and of God. God is in all things. God is everywhere. He's imagining God as a creator very much like himself. He's identifying with God as a kind of the ultimate poet.
It's the romantic artist view of the universe. So yeah. But with these very curious scientific twists too. It is a weird book, and that's part of why it's at the start and the end of my book. Because if you've read poems of Poe or you read short stories, this book doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to fit in the standard view of him. Even though he said, after I've written this, I could do nothing more. I have to die. He really saw it as the culmination of everything he'd done. And I wanted to tell the story of Poe's life so that started to make sense.
Right. No, I think it's interesting because we talk about this a lot with alchemy and early modern science, about this sort of this link between science and religion, this relationship, the way that people talk about things that feels very strange to us because we don't think of them in the same sphere as people did. And that it's a completely different, they have a completely different sort of cultural view of this conversation when they're sort of talking about the divine and his space in science and how he's creating things and, that mirroring. And I loved that. I loved that part in your book where you're talking about that.
Because it's an extremely interesting moment in that history of where science and religion work together. He's born the same year as Darwin. And Eureka is an evolutionary history of the universe. He's drawing on the same sources, really wrestling with the same problems, about the same questions of explanation that Darwin's wrestling with. Darwin is just as influenced by the nebular hypothesis as Poe is. And at the same time, for Poe, God, but a very non-Christian, strange version of God, is central to the account, which is also something we don't often expect from Poe. We think of him as this, extremely, decadent, destroyed, cynical person, but actually there is a kind of religiosity that pulses through a lot of his writing, and especially in the cosmological writing.
Yeah.
And Poe and Darwin both married their first cousin. There you go. So.
There you go.
It worked out better for Darwin, though.
Than Poe, yes. Let's see. So we have a couple of other questions from the chat. So let's see. So this is from Sophie P. And it's in relation to something you mentioned earlier about sort of Poe playing the game. And she asked, did people find out that Poe would write letters to newspapers under different names when he was alive? So we kind of suspect that he did it, but did anyone ever catch him in the act?
I can't think of a moment where there was a big aha where caught you, but it was, as you say, it was playing the game. It wouldn't have been a surprise to anyone that an author would do that kind of, if they're in that mix of authors, especially in New York, where Poe winds up in 1845, where it's just shoulder to shoulder, so many publications, extremely cutthroat, very competitive, where the Sun newspaper has just shown up, which is a penny daily. It's extreme. There's so much competition to sell papers, and authors are at each other's throats left and right. To try to make a name for yourself, it's incredibly difficult. And so it was part of the kind of standard tools of the trade.
Right.
In the Longfellow War, there were accusations that Poe was himself ginning it up at the time that he was writing.
Gotcha.
But no one would have been particularly shocked by that.
Right. Just as we would not be shocked today.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
Exactly.
That's true. Let's see.
Yeah, if you found out that Jonathan Franzen wrote a review of his own book in Amazon.
What?
I mean, it wouldn't be great, but it wouldn't be that shocking.
Yeah.
It wouldn't.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's pretty commonplace. So we have a good question from Fred. Fred, who says, did he take phrenology seriously, as did Whitman?
Yeah, I think he did. It's a great question, but as we were talking about before about the kind of satire and self-satire, it's very hard to pin Poe down on his opinions in lots of cases about science, about anything. He changes his mind a lot. He speaks from a lot of different perspectives in the different publications that he writes for. I think, yes, he at one point he says, we were hesitant and skeptical at first, but now we have to recognize that phrenology has attained the majesty of a science. And then so I think he did believe in it. Maybe not like full on, but he knew it was a discourse that people recognized. So to the point where he would sneak in phrenological analyses of his characters. So when he's describing Roderick Usher, he gives him the kind of head that is characterized phrenologically as someone who has a great deal of ideality, someone who even too much imagination, not able to live in the real world. And he doesn't say, like, I gave a phrenological analysis to Roderick Usher. He just describes what his forehead looks like, and readers would have known what that means. And he says, Poe himself says at one point, I actually had my head read by the phrenologists, but I'm too embarrassed to report to you what they said. It was a species of extravaganza that embarrassed even me. So he's sort of hinting that he's got this incredible skull that phrenologists would be amazed by too. So I do think he believed it. And of course, Whitman, he knew Whitman. The two crossed paths in New York, in Brooklyn. And, Whitman is one of the American authors who really respected Poe. Wasn't sure quite what to do with him, but did take him seriously as an important figure.
Right.
The only major poet, the only poet to show up at Poe's, the dedication for Poe's new marker where he was buried in Baltimore. They invited lots of people, and only Whitman showed up to talk.
Wow. I mean, that is like, I mean, it's, well, I guess that like that actually does kind of like lead into a question that I had because so he writes what's it called? In some words with a mummy, is that what it's called?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of short story, right? And so
Which we have at the Rosenbach. So,
yes,
yeah,
you do.
check
I
out.
was just gonna I was gonna plug you. But and I also used to work at Laurel Hill Cemetery, so this was one of our favorite stories to tell around Halloween because George Glidden is buried there in a manner of speaking. Um and
Is
so
he? But what do you mean in a manner of speaking?
so he is buried there, but there was some back and forth over who would pay for his lot. There was a whole thing about his publisher needing to pay for it because by the time Glidden dies, he's like overseas. He's like kind of fallen out of favor. He's not,
Right.
and so he was in the receiving vault for a for a long time.
And as you know,
Um,
that's amazing poetic justice because he spent his life robbing other people's graves.
Yes, yes. So kind of comes full circle, right? And so because I think Poe talks about, doesn't he talks about Morton in that short story, and he gives Morton a little bit of a hard time too. So I was also wondering about that thing you talked about his ability to sort of satirize others, but satirize himself and like really question what they were believing, which like, Morton and his race science was, it was a widely held popular belief of the time, even if we now look at it and go, oh my gosh, that's insane. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think it is remarkable that story where it's Some Words with a Mummy. It's Glidden named, who is this Egyptologist, a kind of self-declared Egyptologist who made some deals by which he was able to get some mummies and bring them to the U.S. So went on tour showing people the sarcophagus and unwrapped a mummy and was completely
Unwrapping demonstrations. Yes. Yeah, where they unwrap the mummy in front of a live audience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Glidden's in the story, and so is this guy called Dr. Upon Honor, which is like, upon my honor, I swear this is the fact. These are the facts. Yeah. And he's pretty transparently Morton, Samuel Morton. And so I think it is remarkable that Poe is mocking them so kind of ruthlessly as these very confused scientists who are just full of pretensions about their knowledge, and they're wrong about all kinds of things. Right. What they do is they electrocute one of these mummies, an old pharaoh, who then awakens and is quite annoyed to be awakened after 2,000 years of sleep.
As you would.
As you would. And then begin to lecture him about how great Yankee science is. And the mummy's like, have you seen the pyramids? Have you seen our irrigation systems on the Nile? Have you seen our artwork? What have you invented other than quack medicine? So there really is this kind of dig at the claims for progress and great steps forward and living in an unprecedented age. And Poe's interest in the past, his interest in alchemy, and natural magic, but also in the Egyptians, is always kind of being brought forward to say, well, pretty amazing things happened in the past. The idea that history moves forward and that we're at the cutting edge and moving up a peak that no one has ever reached before is just absurd. Right? Humanity is basically the same as it was 6,000 years ago. There's just a few little differences here and there. Right. And that story is great at tweaking all of those claims, and particularly Morton.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So I'm keeping an eye on our chat, and I am also keeping an eye on time. And I know we're coming down the home stretch, so I want to make sure we get out any like last things you want to make sure people know about the book and about sort of diving into this world of Poe and this world of sort of 19th century science.
Well, I think I can see the same comments, and I want to thank the person who mentioned Lacan, who again, psychoanalysis really developed by the Purloined Letter. Yep. And the question, did Whitman and Poe cross paths in Philadelphia or Camden? Not that I'm aware of, but definitely in New York.
It would have been in New York. It's like, because that's early Whitman's career. And, and they're both working there. Yeah. And
Poe published some of his writing in the Broadway Journal. So the guide to the book, I don't know. I think it's, I would treat it as a story, treat it as, because I'm trying to tell it as his life story. There are digressions on the sciences, on the different scientists, but I think you need that to get the overall story. But it follows the life and the writings very closely. So I think approach it that way. I think that there's a great deal of information, but originally I wrote it thinking, would it be possible to write a Poe biography that you read on the beach? And I'm not sure I've managed it, but it's certainly what I was aiming for.
I was not. I mean, I wasn't on a beach, but I did actually go out in my backyard and kind of lay down with the picnic blanket and sort of enjoy nature. So
And that's how I'd recommend it to people, that,
Nice
it's a great Poe biography. You're not just getting your, kind of essays on science in the 19th century and how Poe relates to them. It is a biography of Poe and how he fits into this whole 19th century world of science. And I really like it for that very much.
yeah,
Thanks
for
a lot.
sure.
I guess the other shout out I would give is to the chapter on the domain of Arnhem, which is a story of Poe's that doesn't get a lot of credit, and it's kind of in a weird place in the book, but in a lot of ways it's the heart of Poe's aesthetics, his view of science, his view of America, really. So it deserves.
You were in Philadelphia, but you waited to London to write this book. So.
Right.
I know. What was I
easier
thinking?
for you to work on.
What was it?
That's all right. Listen, you're still a Philadelphian.
Yeah.
It doesn't it counts. You're here forever. It doesn't you can never leave it.
I know. I think Poe saw it that way too. And I mean, there's the ongoing debate about whether Poe is a Boston, a Baltimore, or a Philadelphia.
Oh,
and Ed, you've been at the center of that. And another thing, I might not say this quite so loudly in another setting, but I am very pro Philly in that story. I mean, it's Poe really hits the home stretch in Philly. He figures out what he's all about in Philly. He has his rise and his fall, but really touches on all the things that make him Poe in that city. So I think it's his home.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Now I have the scientific argument to make as well. So as if I needed another argument to make Poe in Philly, but this is a great one.
Exactly. Well, listen, we cannot thank you enough. This was so fun. This was so excellent. I'm thrilled that you were willing to stay up very, very late and chat with us.
Well, it's worth it. And thank you so much for hosting it. It's really great to talk to you. And it's so amazing the collections you both have that, have Poe, but then also radiate throughout that ecosystem that you're talking about, and really show that literature and science are so closely tied together. And I think that's true at both institutions. Great. So super to talk to you both. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So we're going to say a little goodbye to you for a moment. Edna, I think we have a couple of things to wrap up here, right? So you have some things. Can you tell folks sort of how they can get involved with
Rosenbach? I mean, in bringing this program to all of you tonight, we also ask you to support us, both the Science History Institute and the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. Any amount helps, or become a member of the Rosenbach. Alexis can tell you about the Science History Institute. Your support helps us to care for our collections, but also helps us bring the books and manuscripts that we have to life with these kinds of programs. So you can find out more on how you can help us at rosenbach.org. Ways to donate. You can visit us. You can check out the collections yourself. And I thank you for coming tonight. And I hope I will see you at the Rosenbach one of these days.
Indeed. Yes. So for us, yes, same thing. You can definitely support us. It allows us to keep doing this, keep doing all these fantastic things, these great programs, really what our passion is. So you can text Science History to 44-321 if you want to donate, if you're if you're very savvy. You can also visit sciencehistory.org/give and also explore our website. Our museum is open, so you can come and visit us, and you can also, like I said, hang out in our digital collections. So I think I had a great time. This is like we have hung out before because we've had you came on our podcast on distillations and told us everything we need to know about vampires. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And we thank all of you and thank John once again. So everyone enjoy your evening, and we hope you have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.